For 10 years the soldiers came to the western edge of the Sulphur Springs Valley, looked east at a low range of broken granite, and got nothing back. The Dragoon Mountains are not tall by the standards of the West. They run about 15 miles north to south and maybe 8 across at the widest, a wrinkle of rock pushed up out of the desert floor in what is now southeastern Arizona, pale and dry and easy to ride past without turning your head. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. From the valley road, they look like a pile of stones a giant lost interest in. But somewhere inside that maze of domes and crevices and oak-choked canyons was Cochise, chief of the Chokonen band of the Chiricahua Apache, and the most powerful army on the continent could not lay a hand on him. They knew he was in there. On a clear morning, they could sometimes see the thread of smoke from his cook fires. They would assemble a column and ride hard into the rocks, and the rocks would close behind them, and the trail would thin and split and disappear, and the men would come out the far side hours later with blown horses, empty rifles, and the particular sensation of having been watched every minute of the way. This is the story of how that happened and why it went on for so long. Not the Hollywood version, where the chief is either a savage or a saint and the truth gets sanded down to fit a runtime. The real one. It begins with a man who was, by every early account, friendly to the Americans. In the late 1850s, Cochise let the Butterfield Overland Mail run its stagecoaches straight through the heart of his country at Apache Pass. He cut firewood and sold it to the station there. He had fought the Mexicans for most of his life, and the Americans were, for the moment, a different matter. The peace held for a few years. Then in February of 1861, a young, inexperienced Army lieutenant made a decision at a stage stop, and that single decision lit a fire that would burn across 2 territories for more than a decade and cost hundreds of lives on both sides. The strange part, the part the cavalry could never quite accept, was that the man at the center of it almost never had to fight in the open to win. He simply had to disappear, and he had a place built for disappearing. To understand the war, you have to understand the ground, because in this story the ground is almost a character. Picture the Sulphur Springs Valley first. It is wide and flat and burnt brown most of the year, scrub and sagebrush running off toward the horizon. On the western edge of it, near the modern town of Wilcox, sits a dry lake bed the old maps call the Wilcox Playa, a pale alkali flat that shimmers in the heat and floods shallow in the wet season when the cranes come. From high ground around that valley, a man with good eyes could see movement for 30 or 40 miles. A column of cavalry kicks up dust. Dust hangs in dry desert air. The Apache watching from the rocks would know the soldiers were coming long before the soldiers knew anything at all. Now the Dragoons themselves. The range is split down its spine into 2 natural fortresses, an eastern stronghold and a western one, each with its own canyon climbing up out of the valley. What made the place close to perfect was a detail of geology that no engineer could have designed better. High in the mountains, the 2 canyons nearly meet. A trail connects them across the crest. So a band that rode up into the western canyon pursued by troops could slip over the top and come down the eastern side, or the reverse, and be gone into a different valley entirely by the time the soldiers reached the place they thought they were headed. The canyons are a chaos of granite, great rounded domes and balanced boulders the size of houses, sheer faces, hidden pockets of shade. Oak and juniper grow thick in the bottoms. There was water year-round. There was wood, there was grass for the horses, there was game. A people could live up there indefinitely, and they did. The Chiricahua considered it a sacred place long before it became a fort, and they knew every passage, every dead end, every spot where a single man with a rifle could hold a trail against 20. The army knew none of this. That was the whole problem in a sentence. The soldiers had maps that barely admitted the range existed. They had no scouts who knew the interior. They were heavy, loud, slow, dependent on water they had to carry or fight for, and they were trying to corner a man who had grown up in those rocks and could move through them at night without a sound. Catching Cochise in the Dragoons was not like catching an army. It was like trying to grab smoke with your fist. And here is the thing the soldiers never fully reckoned with. They were not chasing an army with a base to capture and a supply train to cut. They were chasing a people who carried their entire world on their backs and could be somewhere else by morning. A Chiricahua camp was a cluster of brush wickiups that took an hour to build and minutes to abandon. There were no warehouses to burn, no walls to breach, no fixed thing to seize. When word came that troops were in the valley, the women could strike camp and move the children, the old people, and what little the band owned up and over a ridge faster than a cavalry horse could climb it. The men traveled light and hard. An Apache war party on foot could cover 40 or 50 miles in a day across country that broke down shod horses, and they could go without water for stretches that would have killed the men hunting them. They knew which barrel cactus held moisture, which hidden tanks caught the rain, which springs ran in. Which season? A soldier needed a canteen, a mount, hardtack, and a line of supply running all the way back to a fort. An Apache needed a knife in the desert he was born in. You cannot besiege people like that. You cannot starve them out of a country that feeds them. The only way to beat them was to find them, and finding them was the one thing the Dragoons were built to prevent. The man himself was tall for his time, while over 6 feet by the accounts of those who met him, broad through the chest, with a presence that even his enemies wrote about with a kind of reluctant awe. His name in Apache has been rendered different ways, but it comes down to the same image every time. Oak. Hardwood. The strength of the oak. We do not know exactly when he was born. Sources put it anywhere from around 1805 to about 1815, and the truth is simply lost. We know he rose to lead the Chokonen, sometimes called the Chokonen, the band whose country centered on these mountains and the passes around them. We know he was married into power, his father-in-law being the formidable Mimbreno chief Mongas Coloratus, Red Sleeves, one of the great Apache leaders of the age. And we know that until 1861 Cochise had kept his people at an uneasy distance from the Americans, raiding into Mexico in the old pattern, but leaving the new arrivals largely alone. Then came the boy. In January of 1861, a war party raided the ranch of a man named John Ward, down near the Sonoyta Creek, ran off some cattle, and carried away Ward's young stepson, a boy of about 12 named Felix. Ward went to the army demanding the child back, and he pointed at Cochise. Here the record and the legend split hard, and it matters. The boy had not been taken by Cochise's people at all. He had been taken by a different group of Apaches, Western Apaches, the Coyoteros. The man the army was about to declare war on was, in this specific instance, innocent. As for the boy, history has its own grim joke to play. Felix Ward grew up among the Apache and became, of all things, a famous army scout and interpreter known as Mickey Free, who would later hunt the very people he was raised by. But all of that lay in the future. In February of 1861, there was only a furious rancher, a missing child, and a young officer eager to prove himself. The officer was Lieutenant George Bascom, fresh from West Point, in command of about 54 infantrymen. He marched to Apache Pass and sent word that he wanted to talk. Cochise, having no reason to fear a parley and no knowledge that he was the accused, came in under a flag of truce. He brought family with him, by various accounts his wife, his young son, his brother, and a few others. Bascom welcomed them, fed them, invited them into his tent. And then, at a prearranged signal, soldiers surrounded the canvas. Bascom told Cochise he and his people were under arrest and would be held until the boy and the cattle were returned. Cochise said, truthfully, that he did not have the boy and did not know who did, but that he would try to find out. Bascom did not believe him. What Cochise did next became legend among his own descendants, who remember the whole disaster to this day by a single phrase: cut the tent. He pulled a knife, slashed through the canvas wall, and was out and running through a line of startled soldiers before they understood what had happened. Bullets followed him. He took a graze and kept going and vanished into the hills. But his relatives did not get out. His brother and his nephews remained in Bascom's hands. Now both sides had hostages, because Cochise immediately took some of his own, seizing men off the road, off a passing wagon train and the stage line, anyone he could grab, to trade for his family. For a few days messages went back and forth across the pass while the standoff tightened. The Apache cut off the soldiers' access to the spring and forced them to dig for water inside their own position. Negotiations failed. There is some dispute about exactly who killed whom first, but the ending is not in dispute. Cochise killed his captives, and Bascom, joined now by relief troops who had captured a few more Apaches on the road, hanged 6 men from the oak trees by the pass. 3 of them were from Cochise's own party, including his brother Cointura. The soldiers left the bodies hanging. Because of Apache beliefs about the dead, the corpses were a particular kind of horror, and they swung in those trees for a long time, slowly becoming bone, a sight meant as a warning and received as a declaration of war that could never be unsaid. That is the Bascom Affair. 10 men dead over a boy Cochise never took. And out of it came a war that historians have described as no quarter on both sides. A war with almost no pitched battles and a great deal of ambush, raid, burning, and killing across the length of the Arizona and New Mexico frontier. Cochise rode out of Apache Pass a changed man. The Americans had broken a truce, seized him under a white flag, and executed his brother. He joined his father-in-law Mongas Coloradus, and together they began to make the territory ungovernable. For a little, while the timing favored them in a way no one could have planned. The United States was tearing itself apart in civil war. Federal troops were pulled out of the Southwest to fight in the East. Forts emptied. The new arrivals who had crowded into Apache country suddenly found themselves alone with a people they had just turned into implacable enemies. Settlers abandoned ranches, mines shut down. Whole stretches of road went silent because no one dared travel them. For a season, it looked as though the Apache might simply push the Americans back out of the country the way they had pushed others before. But the war came back, in the form of a column of California volunteers marching east in 1862 to keep the Confederates out of New Mexico. Their commander was General James Carleton, and their road home ran straight through Apache Pass, straight through the one reliable water source for miles, the spring that Cochise and Mongas Coloradus now intended to deny them. In July of 1862, an advanced detachment under Captain Thomas Roberts pushed into the pass. The numbers in the old accounts vary, as they always do, but Roberts had something like 100 to 140 men, infantry with a few cavalry scouts, and 2 mountain howitzers hauled along on their wheels. Waiting on the heights above the pass, behind stone breastworks they had built among the rocks, were the Apache. Estimates of their strength run from a couple hundred up to 500. And given that 2 great chiefs had combined their bands, the higher figures are plausible. The Apache let the soldiers march into the narrow ground, exhausted and desperate for water, and then opened fire from above. For a few hours it went well for them. They had the high ground, the cover, and the better position, and the soldiers could not reach the spring. Then Roberts brought up the howitzers. The Apache had never faced artillery. They called the guns wagons, because they came on wheels, and they did not understand that a wagon could throw fire up into the rocks where men were hiding. The shells burst among the breastworks. There is a famous line that comes down to us through Captain John Cremeny, who heard it later from an Apache who was there. "We would have done well enough," the man said, "if you had not fired wagons at us." How many Apache died at Apache Pass is one of those questions the record refuses to settle. Carleton, in his official report, put Apache losses at around 10. Cremeny passed along that same Apache account claiming 63 warriors killed by the artillery and only 3 by rifle fire. The truth is probably somewhere in between and will never be known. What is certain is that Mongas Coloradus took a bullet in the chest during the fight, that the Apache could not hold their spring against the guns, and that they faded back toward the Dragoons. Carleton, shaken by how close the pass had come to being a death trap, ordered a permanent fort built there to guard the water. They named it Fort Bowie, and it would sit in the throat of Apache Pass for the rest of the Apache Wars. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The wounding of Mongas Coloradus led to the next great wound. Carried into Mexico to recover, the old chief survived. But the following January, in 1863, he was lured to a parley at Fort McLean in New Mexico under a promise of safe talk, and there he was seized. That night he was tortured with heated bayonets and then shot, the official story being that he was killed while trying to escape. His head was later boiled and the skull sent east. To Cochise, it was Bascom all over again. The same lesson taught a second time in blood. The Americans would use the flag of truce as a trap. From that point, Cochise trusted no parley, no promise, no white officer's word. He became the principal war chief of the Chiricahua, and he withdrew into the rocks, and the long disappearance began in earnest. This is the stretch of years that gave the soldiers their reputation for futility and gave Cochise his for sorcery, because to the men who chased him it could seem like nothing else. He would strike somewhere out in the open country, a ranch, a wagon, a stretch of the Butterfield Road, and then he would be gone, back up into the Dragoons before any column could be raised. One old account holds that over a span of about 16 months, his warriors killed 22 stagecoach drivers along the route that ran past his mountains. Whether the precise count holds up or not, the pattern is well attested. The road that had once run safely through his country now ran with the dead. And every time the army tried to follow him home, the home defeated them. Think about what the cavalry was actually attempting. A patrol would ride out from Fort Bowie or one of the other posts, sometimes a day or more away, across open desert where their dust announced them the whole way. By the time they reached the base of the Dragoons, the lookouts on the heights had been tracking them for hours. The Apache had a system of watchers posted where they could see the valley floor for miles, and signals to pass the word inward. So the column would arrive at a canyon mouth already empty. They would push up into the rocks, and the trail would lead them into ground where a horse could barely pass, where a few hidden riflemen could pin a whole troop, where the canyon might dead end against a granite wall or fork into 3 passages with no way to tell which the quarry took. And all the while the band they were chasing might already be crossing the high trail to the far side of the range and dropping into another valley entirely. The soldiers were fighting the mountain as much as the man, and the mountain had been the Chiricahua's ally for generations. There was another card the cavalry could never trump, and it lay beyond their reach entirely. The Dragoons were the near refuge, but they were not the only one. Far to the south, across the line into Mexico, rose the Sierra Madre, a vast tangle of canyons and pine ridges that made the Dragoons look small. American soldiers could not legally cross the border to follow, and for years they did not. So when the heat in Arizona grew too great, the Chiricahua could drift south to relatives. Among the other bands, raid the Mexican settlements as their grandfathers had, and come north again when the pressure eased. The whole Chiricahua world was a web of related bands spread across 2 countries, the Chokonen, the Chehen, the Badonko, the Nedni, tied by blood and marriage, and able to take one another in. A man pursued in one place had kin to shelter him in 3 others, and the people fed themselves off the ground the soldiers saw as barren. The women roasted the hearts of the agave in stone-lined pits until they turned to something sweet, gathered acorns and piñon nuts and the pods of the mesquite, dried the meat of deer and of the cattle and horses taken in raids. A camp could provision itself without ever buying a sack of flour. Put it together, the near fortress and the far one, the network of kin and the knowledge of how to live where nothing seemed to grow, and you begin to see why the word impregnable kept turning up in the officers' reports. It was not flattery. It was closer to a confession. The terrain did something to the soldiers' minds, too. To hunt a man for years and never see him, to feel watched and never find the watcher, to lose friends to ambushes that materialized out of bare rock and vanished again, was on an army. The reports of the period are full of frustration that curdles into a kind of awe. Officers wrote of the stronghold as impregnable, of an enemy who could not be brought to battle, of a chief who seemed to know their movements before they made them. They were not wrong about the last part. He often did. By the late 1860s, the toll of all this had spread far past the soldiers and the warriors. The decade of raiding and reprisal hollowed out whole districts of southern Arizona. Ranches stood abandoned with their roofs caved in. Mines that had drawn men west sat flooded and silent. Travelers moved in armed groups or not at all, and the graves beside the roads multiplied until they were their own kind of map. Newspapers in Tucson screamed for extermination. The Army mounted expedition after expedition into the Chiricahua country and the Dragoons, and the pattern almost never changed. Long marches, fouled water, a few brief firefights against an enemy who melted back into the rock, and a return to the fort with little to show but worn-out animals and a longer list of the dead. Now and then a column caught a small camp and killed the people in it, and called it a victory, and it changed nothing, because Cochise was never in the camp they found. He was a man the size of a war, and the war could not be ended by killing the people around him. It could only be ended by killing him, which no one managed, or by giving him a reason to stop, which no one had yet found a way to offer. It is worth pausing here on the legend, because this is where the popular story goes soft. Generations of readers met Cochise through a 1947 novel called Blood Brother and the hugely popular 1950 film made from it, Broken Arrow, in which a noble chief and a noble white friend forge peace through pure mutual respect. The film moved a lot of people, and it got one real thing right, that there was a genuine friendship at the center of how this war ended. But it also smoothed the edges off history, and one of the most cherished stories that came out of that era deserves a harder look. The tale goes that a male superintendent named Tom Jeffords, fed up with losing riders to Apache ambush, rode alone and unarmed deep into Cochise's stronghold around 1867, won the chief's respect by his sheer nerve, and struck a personal pact that spared the mail carriers thereafter. It is a wonderful story. The historical record is less tidy. Historians who have gone back through the actual mail records, Edwin Sweeney and Doug Hocking among them, have found that attacks on mail riders did not stop after the supposed 1867 pact, that riders and escorts kept dying through 1869 and beyond, and that the famous solo ride probably did not happen the way the legend tells it, or in that year at all. The most careful reconstructions place the first real personal meeting between the two men closer to 1870 or 1871. What does survive scrutiny is the friendship itself, and it is remarkable enough without the embroidery. Thomas Jonathan Jeffords was a frontiersman out of western New York, born on the first day of 1832, who had drifted west and worked at scouting and mail running and prospecting through the worst years of the Apache War. He was tall, red-bearded, quiet, and unusually willing to deal with the Apache as men rather than as targets. At some point he made contact with Cochise, learned a working amount of the Apache language, and earned something almost no other American ever got from the chief: trust. The basis of it, by the account of those who knew them both, was a single rule Cochise laid down at the start. Do not lie to me. What you tell your own men is your business, the chief is supposed to have said, but to me you must always tell the truth. Jeffords kept that rule for the rest of Cochise's life, and the chief came to call him brother. Jeffords later described Cochise as a splendid physical specimen, 6'2", with the eye of an eagle, a man whose religion, he said, was truth and loyalty. He also said, plainly, that he sometimes had to guide soldiers against Cochise, and that it never once damaged the friendship between them. They were on opposite sides of a war, and they respected each other across it. It is worth understanding what kind of country Cochise was being asked to trust, because something had happened in the spring of 1871 that no Apache could forget. Near Camp Grant on the San Pedro River, a band of Aravaipa and Pinal Apaches under a chief named Escamizan had come in, surrendered most of their weapons, and settled under the protection of a young army officer, Lieutenant Royal Whitman, who let them plant crops and hire on with the local ranchers. They were doing exactly what the government claimed it wanted. On the morning of April 30th, 1871, while most of the men were away from camp, a mob out of Tucson, something like 140 Anglo-Americans, Mexican-Americans, and Tohono-O'odham allies, fell on the sleeping village. In under half an hour they clubbed and shot to death somewhere between 100 and 140 people, the overwhelming majority of them women and children. They carried off perhaps 30 surviving children and sold or indentured them. The men responsible were put on trial in Tucson, and a jury acquitted every one of them after deliberating for a matter of minutes. The Camp Grant massacre horrified much of the rest of the nation and helped push President Grant toward the peace policy in the first place. But to Cochise, it carried a plainer message, the same one Bascom and Fort McLean had already burned into him: that coming in, laying down your arms, trusting the white man's protection, could get your women and children murdered in their sleep. When Jeffords first tried to draw him toward the talks, part of what held Cochise back was precisely this. He would not lead his family down out of the rocks into the open while the ashes of Camp Grant were still warm. By the early 1870s, the shape of the conflict was changing. Cochise was aging, somewhere in his 60s, and his people were worn down by a decade of war, by hunger, by the steady arithmetic of attrition that the Apache could never win in the long run no matter how many tactical victories the Dragoons handed them. The federal government, under President Grant's so-called peace policy, was looking for ways to end the bleeding by negotiation rather than extermination. In 1871 and into 1872, Cochise, came into the area around Canada Alamosa in New Mexico to talk. He listened. He was willing to consider peace. But when the government proposed moving his people to the Tularosa Valley, away from their mountains, he refused and slipped back into the rocks. He would have peace, but not at the price of his homeland. That was the sticking point, and it was non-negotiable. Breaking that deadlock took two men, one of them already in the story and one of them new to it. The new man was General Oliver Otis Howard, a deeply religious one-armed veteran of the Civil War who had run the Freedmen's Bureau and was sometimes called the Christian General. Grant sent him west with broad authority to make peace with Cochise directly. Howard was smart enough to know he could not do it with an army at his back, and smart enough to ask who could get him to the chief. The answer came back from everyone he asked, agency clerks and ranchers and scouts alike. Only one man could take him to Cochise, and that man was Tom Jeffords. Jeffords agreed, on conditions. Howard would come nearly alone, with only a young lieutenant named Joseph Sladen and a few others. No column, no show of force. To ride into the stronghold with soldiers would be to invite the same fate Mongas Coloradus had met. Howard accepted. And so in October of 1872, Jeffords led the general up into the Dragoon Mountains, into the very fortress the army had failed for a decade to penetrate, not as conquerors, but as guests. When they reached the camp, by some accounts at a high meadow in the range, Cochise greeted Jeffords by throwing his arms around him. Among the Apache present helping to interpret in those days, according to several accounts, was a younger Chiricahua who would later carry the war on long after Cochise was gone. His name was Geronimo. For something like 11 days the talks went on, in a camp of brush wickiups high in the rocks, the general and the chief feeling their way toward terms with Jeffords between them. Howard at first proposed a reservation somewhere else. Cochise said no, the same as before. What he wanted was his own country. The Dragoons, the Chiricahua Mountains, the passes and valleys his people had always held. And he wanted Jeffords, and no one else, as the agent who would deal with his band on behalf of the government. Howard, to his lasting credit, listened and agreed. The reservation would be in the homeland. Jeffords would be the agent. The war would stop. On the strength of that agreement, peace finally came to a corner of the country that had not known it in 11 years. By executive order in December of 1872, the Chiricahua Apache Reservation was created, a vast block of land, something on the order of 3,000 square miles of southeastern Arizona, the heart of it the very mountains Cochise had defended. Tom Jeffords took up the impossible job of agent. And Cochise, for the first time since a young lieutenant cut a flag of truce to ribbons, brought his people down out of the rocks to live in the open. He had a little under 2 years left. The peace held while he lived, which says a great deal about the weight of his word among his own people, because keeping that many young warriors quiet after a decade of war was no small thing. He was already sick, probably with some kind of cancer of the stomach, and through the spring of 1874 he failed steadily. Jeffords came to him near the end. There is an exchange between the two men that comes down through the historian Edwin Sweeney, and whether every word is exact or not, it has the ring of two friends who did not lie to each other. Cochise asked Jeffords whether he thought they would ever see each other alive again. Jeffords told him the truth as he had always promised to. No, he did not think so. He thought Cochise would be dead. By the next night, Cochise agreed, and set the time himself, about 10 the next morning. Then he asked whether the two of them would meet again after death. Jeffords said he did not know, and asked the chief his opinion. Cochise said he had been thinking about it a good deal while he lay sick, and that he believed they would, that good friends would meet again, up there, and he pointed at the sky. He died on the morning of June 8, 1874, close to the hour he had named. His people wailed through the night. Then his closest relatives prepared his body in the old way, painted his face and the body of his war horse, and the band carried him deep into the rocks of the stronghold for the last time. The exact details have several versions, as the secret was meant to be kept, and was. By one account, they lowered him with lariats into a deep crevice among the granite, along with his horse and his favorite dog and his weapons, the things a warrior would need in the next world. By another, they buried him east of the stronghold, and then rode their horses back and forth across the ground until no trace of the grave remained, until even they could no longer find the exact spot. Either way, the result was the same. The only American who knew the place was Tom Jeffords, and Jeffords carried it to his own grave in 1914 and never told a soul. To this day, no one knows where Cochise lies. The mountains kept him the way they had always kept him, hidden, unreachable, his own. So why were the soldiers baffled for 10 years? Strip away the talk of an unfindable chief who seemed to vanish at will, and the answer is almost mundane, and that is what makes it remarkable. Cochise was not magic. He was a brilliant reader of ground who happened to be defending the one piece of ground in all the Southwest most perfectly suited to defense, against an army that did not know the terrain, could not move through it, announced its every approach across 40 miles of open desert, and depended on water and supply lines that the Apache could see and cut. He had lookouts who turned the valley into a giant early warning system. He had a fortress with 2 faces and a secret door over the top. He had a people who had lived in those rocks for generations and could survive in them indefinitely. And he had a reason to fight that the army itself had handed him at the end of a hangman's rope at Apache Pass. The cavalry kept asking how one man could disappear into a 15-mile range of rock. They never quite grasped that he had not disappeared at all. He was right there, watching them come, every single time. There is a temptation, telling a story like this, to make it a simple tale of a hero and his mountain. And Cochise was a great man by any honest measure, a leader who held his people together through 11 years of war and then secured them a homeland by the strength of his word at the negotiating table. But the record asks us to hold more than one true thing at once. This was a brutal war on every side. Cochise killed his captives at Apache Pass. His raids left dead drivers in the road and burned ranches across the territory. The Americans seized him under a white flag, hanged his brother, tortured and killed his father-in-law, and broke faith again and again until a man who had been their friend became the most dangerous enemy they had in the Southwest. There were no clean hands here, and the dignity owed to the dead is owed to all of them, the soldiers and the settlers and the warriors and the families on both sides who paid for decisions made by other men. And the peace that Cochise won did not outlast him by much, which is its own quiet tragedy. He had built the agreement around 2 things, his homeland and his friend Jeffords. Within 2 years of his death, the reservation was under attack from politicians who wanted it gone. By 1876, it was dissolved. Jeffords was removed as agent, and the Chiricahua were ordered moved away from the mountains Cochise had given everything to keep. Many were sent to the San Carlos Reservation, ground they hated. Some, including the young interpreter Geronimo, broke away rather than go, and the wars flared on for another 10 years until Geronimo's final surrender in 1886, after which the Chiricahua as a people were shipped east as prisoners of war to Florida and Alabama and eventually Oklahoma, far from everything they knew. The homeland Cochise had secured by refusing every other offer was taken back almost as soon as he was no longer there to hold it. What remains is the rock and the name. The county is called Cochise. So is a town, and a stronghold, and a stretch of canyon that anyone can hike today, up through the granite domes and the oak and the juniper, past the dry stream crossings, to the high places where a man once stood and watched the soldiers raise their dust 40 miles out and knew, every time, that he had hours to spare. The mountains have not changed much. The water still runs in the canyon bottoms in season. The cranes still come to the playa. And somewhere up in that maze of stone, in a crevice no one has ever found, in ground his own people rode over until it forgot itself, lies the chief the United States Army chased for 10 years and never once caught. His name meant oak, the hardest wood there is. Remember it, and remember the brother who kept his grave a secret for 40 years, and remember the people who lived in those rocks long before any of this and were sent away from them in the end. The frontier did not come quietly to the Dragoon Mountains, and it did not come fairly, and the man at the center of it deserves to be remembered as he was, not as a ghost who vanished into the granite, but as a leader who knew his country better than his enemies ever could, and used it, and held it, for as long as one man could. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.